Hello and welcome to a presentation being brought to you by Golden Century Wellness. Please feel free to visit our website at www.goldencenturywellness.com. Today, our presentation is going to be on domestic violence. So, disclosure statement. Looking at victims, abusers, and survivors, we wanted to make note that sometimes abusers are also victims as well of either domestic violence or some type of trauma, and that they may also be surviving those experiences as well. A lot of times abusers don't either acknowledge or are in treatment for their own victimization, but there have been several instances and cases where abusers have abused because they've been victims themselves, and their treatment only focuses on their abusive behaviors. And then also acknowledging that, there are survivors and there's information also pertaining to survivors and how to look at the experience from a different perspective. Gender biases. There is material that points to males having a more dominant role and different privileges and aspects as it relates to domestic violence. We considered that. We will also discuss that later on, but to acknowledge that early on that there's often material that show or point at men as often being the abusers and not victims as well. When we are looking at terminology, this is also in reference to gender. Moving forward, we understand that some people don't identify with all the different pronouns. Or they identify with a specific pronoun. So moving forward, when there's the word male, female, or man or woman, or female or male, we're referencing the gender assigned at birth. For the sake of time, we do respect people's choices in their gender identity. We want to make note and discuss that now and admit that moving forward, we're referencing the birth of the gender assigned at birth. And then triggers. By all means, we understand and know and acknowledge the fact that this information could be triggering for someone who has either know someone or have personal experienced domestic violence. We ask in advance of people, please consider taking care of themselves when reviewing this material, to reach out to someone who may be able to provide support, and to also take care of themselves, because this can be a very sensitive topic. So our objectives for this PowerPoint are to review some major points in history. There is a very, very long timeline, so there's going to be quite a bit of information about the history of domestic violence and how it's progressed legally, training-wise, and advocacy. There's going to be a definition of domestic violence, just one, and then there's going to be quite a bit of research and statistics also embedded into the presentation, both data or both references of statistics and research will be on men and women. Then we're going to look at 3 power of control wheels, and then a triangle, which is the Catman's drama triangle. And then we're going to look at a variety of counseling approaches that are also used or can be used to help with domestic violence and or mental health issues. So with the history of domestic violence, we took a few moments in time or a few moments in history and incorporated that into 3 slides. There are several websites that have a more detailed timeline of history of domestic violence. There's actually some documents that exist. I know one of my learning experiences and one of my references is easily about 5 pages of history on domestic violence in itself. So we have a lot of different years to look at, several different events, and actually some of these events were not in the United States, were different countries. So if you are interested in learning or hearing a little bit more details about the history, please feel free to reach out to us. And also there's 2 references to our history. So looking at 753 BC, the rule of thumb. This law was so that husbands were not held accountable for their wives' crimes. The law actually protected them from anything their wives do, even though the husband was considered responsible for their wife. This law also allowed husbands to punish their wives with a tool or an item as long as it was not bigger than their thumb. So that is 2 of the components from the rule of thumb. In 1500, or in the 1500s, a husband was allowed to actually kill his wife, was not charged for this. In the 1600s, there was the first shelter that has been documented was created, which allowed a woman to escape from home if she was experiencing domestic violence. In the 1700s, there was actually a case of 2 women in a relationship where domestic violence occurred, and this case was or has been known to be the first case of a same-sex domestic violence case. In the 1800s, the Supreme Court declared wife beating illegal and also marital rape to be illegal. So then in the 1900s, a wife beating gains public attention. And we looked at a lot of the things that actually occurred in the 1900s is where we also saw a lot of this actually focused on what was occurring in the United States. So again, in 1910, the Supreme Court denied a wife the right to prosecute her husband for assault. And then in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we had the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the feminist movement, and domestic violence training. The domestic violence training actually began in California with the California police department in California. In 1978, a husband was acquitted for actually raping his wife. So the history took a progressive turn in the 1980s. In 1979, we saw 250 shelters for battered women created. In 1980, that number doubled to 500 shelters for battered women. In 1981, the observation and creation of the Date of Unity was developed. Breast Cancer Awareness Month is actually observed in October. So this was created in 1981. This is where individuals who have lost family members or friends to domestic violence can mourn or collaborate and mourn the death of their loved ones or loss of their loved ones. It's also a unification moment where survivors can get together and celebrate their survival, and also look at ways to revamp or renew domestic violence training. So by 1983, there are 700 shelters for battered women. By 1989, there are over 1,200 shelters for battered women. From 1994 to 2000, the Violence Against Women Act was created. This was given a funded budget of $1.6 billion to address and combat domestic violence and to improve domestic violence training. The act was again renewed in the year 2000, where there is a budget of $3.3 billion for combating domestic violence and improving and promoting domestic violence training. Now, we ended our history here because a lot of changes were made with the court system, with the legal system. There was a decrease in some of the histories. As you can see, there was more support systems in place, more funding in place as well. Also noting that there was a battered shelter in California, I believe in the year 2015, that would also admit men who had experienced domestic violence issues. As far as the training, ironically, training also developed in California with the police department as it relates to officers responding to domestic violence cases or phone calls. In 2017, there was a male domestic violence or battered shelter. I believe that one is in Arkansas, or was in Arkansas. And then another one was also opened in Texas that was for male battered individuals as well. So some growth and change and shift as well, to help support men who had experienced some type of domestic violence. In some cases, men could have gone into the shelters with children, and also looking at individuals from the LGBTQ community where there may be hotels or residential facilities set up to provide some type of living environment or a way to escape battery as a result of domestic violence. So that is the conclusion of our history. Now that we've covered some relevant moments in history and in time, we're going to go ahead and look at a definition for domestic violence. Please note that we did use two different resources as a point of reference in creating this definition, and it is by no means to be considered the only definition for domestic violence. Domestic violence is willful intimidation, physical violence, sexual violence, psychological aggression, stalking, or patterns of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against the other. Now, after looking at the definition, we can also see that there is a cycle of violence in a domestic relationship. This doesn't necessarily mean that this cycle is, or in a relationship can enter this cycle at any point in time, but also note and point out that in the center of this cycle is a form of denial, which can be the batterer could be in a form of denial, or the victim could be in a form of denial. So looking at honeymoon stage first, typically people see honeymoon stage as the beginning stages of a relationship. Again, this could be at any given point in time. This could be a case where, a situation where there's tension building in a relationship, and then there's the honeymoon stage. So this is actually a cycle of what domestic violence or violence can look like. So the honeymoon part of the cycle could be when a batterer is saying, "I'm sorry," promises to get help, goes to friends or family for support, says, "I'll never do it again," wants to be intimate, declares love, or cries. A victim in the honeymoon stage may decide to stay with the batterer. They may take them back. They'll attempt to stop any legal proceedings, whether it's an order of protection, counseling, divorce. They may set up counseling for a batter, or feel happy or hopeful that the relationship will continue. The tension building stage is when the batterer can be moody, nitpicking, verbally abusive by making threats, yelling, or putting an individual down. They may engage in drinking or drugs, may withdraw affection, criticize, or just have a bad temper. The victim will often be nurturing or passive. They may do things like stay with their family, keep their children quiet, keep the house clean, agree with the batterer, try to reason with the batterer, do things like cook their favorite foods, or feel like they're walking on eggshells or experience feelings of a roller coaster of emotions. The person may even try to soothe or attempt to soothe their partner. So that's the tension building part of the cycle. Looking at the acute explosive part of the cycle is when the batterer often becomes more physical, where there's hitting, choking, humiliation, imprisonment, rape, use of weapons, verbal abuse, and destruction of property. Then we look at the victim, where the victim may try to protect themselves or their children. They may call the police. They may try to calm down the batterer or try to reason with that person. In some instances, they fight back and or leave. The acute explosion stage is also usually when a police officer may be involved, or counselors may be involved, or someone from either a helping professional or government agency is involved because the violence has escalated to a criminal activity or a more violent type of activity. So this is where anyone who's involved may have to engage in some type of investigation behavior to see who's actually the victim, who actually the batterer is, what the situation is actually in need of. Some victims have been known to call the police and then protect their batterer once the police arrive, or seek hospitalization and deny that they were even physically violated. So this part of the cycle is usually when, again, there's a third person that's involved. So far, this cycle includes 3 different types of violence, and most of those types of violence can be found or seen in the definition of domestic violence. Let's go ahead and shift gears a little bit. A lot of that information can be very heavy to digest and process. It can also be somewhat triggering. So we're going to go ahead and look at some statistics on domestic violence. All of this information was found on the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence website. They do quite a bit of research on statistics related to domestic violence victims. So this is just a little bit of what they display or have provided on their website. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience a severe form of domestic violence. 1 in 3 women and 1 of 4 men experience physical violence. 1 in 7 women and 1 in 25 men have suffered an injury as a result of domestic violence. 1 in 10 women have been raped by an intimate partner, and the data for men is unavailable. So hopefully that'll change in the near future. There has been a slight movement in regards to treatment for men when it relates, or as it relates to domestic violence. There is a history of men underreporting their experiences as well. So wanted to give a little balance out, or provide some balance on what both men and women are experiencing as far as domestic violence statistics are concerned. Again, we use the same reference to look at the different types of impact that domestic violence has had. 3 of those types would be the economy, the criminal system or legal system, and also medical issues and concerns. We are going to address mental health issues in a separately. So the economy is impacted by domestic violence, an estimated $8 billion a year. This includes individuals being paid for time off, for services, for loss of wages, for loss of productivity and economic growth. When we look at criminal activity, stalking, rape, murder, and homicide have definitely changed the legal system as far as domestic violence cases and concerns go. Also, now one of the newer forms of criminal activity has been stalking via social media or harassment via some source of technology. There's also been quite a bit of changes with children and bullying as well, increasing and improving criminal charges and ways to handle those type of situations from a different approach. Then also medical issues. Individuals who suffer physical violence can often suffer from concussions, head trauma. There's often situations where individuals are also needing dental work. Work with a woman who experienced losing several teeth and having her jaw dislocated, so medical issues is also a concern. STDs and HIV transmission for individuals who are experiencing sexual violence also pose being impacted by those concerns as well. Now we're going to go ahead and look at mental health. So there are several other areas that are impacted by domestic violence other than the economy, criminal activity, and medical. Now we're looking at mental health. And we wanted to separate mental health because we're going to go a little bit more in depth in mental health issues and concerns. We also wanted to mention that it's important to realize and understand that an individual may have pre-existing mental health concerns prior to being exposed to and or suffering from domestic violence. They may also experience, develop, or display mental health symptoms and signs after experiencing domestic violence as well. Also noting that some individuals are likely to see an increase or decrease in symptoms depending on where they're at in their situation. Sometimes being exposed to some form of violence can impact the severity of symptoms. So the mental health disorders that we have are in the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, the 5th edition, which is the DSM-5, that will list the criteria for adults and children. It will also provide a criteria on how long an individual should have the symptoms, how frequent or the time length required for a diagnosis, and also go into more detail about what the symptoms consist of. So post-traumatic stress disorder is often when an individual experiences a traumatic event or some type of violent event, and they will engage in avoiding repeated exposure to that event, and they may also show signs of distress. Acute stress disorder, an individual may be irritable, lack focus, be unable to focus at work or school, for example. Major depression disorder, individual will verbalize feelings of hopelessness or guilt. Generalized anxiety disorder, where a person may express or experience long periods of worrying or moments of restlessness. And then suicide ideation is when an individual is a harm to themselves or others. Again, this is a very brief. There is a criteria for all the disorders listed that can be found in a DSM-5 manual, or a mental health provider can provide an assessment tool in order to diagnose mental health disorders. So the mental health disorders that were discussed could be seen as mental health disorders that are pre-existing or as a result of, but definitely impacted by domestic violence. So we wanted to mention that personality disorders and research related to personality disorders with victims and or abusers are often considered as well. Borderline disorder and narcissistic disorder are two personality disorders that are often found associated with um, domestic violence abusers or victims. Then there's mood disorders, as discussed, which were depression and anxiety. This can also be found in abusers and victims. Substance abuse disorders can also be found among abusers and victims. They can be developed as a coping skill for someone who's experiencing domestic violence. They can be a result of someone experiencing domestic violence, and again, they could be impacted by domestic violence. So developmental disorders, this looks at individuals who are at different levels of functioning, or their development is different, and so they can be impacted by domestic violence as well. Sometimes individuals who have developmental disorders don't fully understand what's being done to them or considered higher risk populations. Then we look at neurological disorders. This can be a result of domestic violence if someone has suffered from physical violence to the head or suffered some type of brain trauma. Then we also have children and adolescent concerns. Some common concerns are anxiety, depression, aggression, and oppositional behaviors. All of these are also disorders that can be found in the DSM, but they're also concerns that individuals should consider when working with children or parents of children and adolescents who are witnesses to domestic violence. So the power and control wheel is a very popular model and intervention used in domestic violence. This is probably one of the older or original power control wheel models. And the reason why we wanted to point out the differences in the models is because they often reflect, or this wheel reflects, terminology that can be considered biased or one-sided. Looking under using intimidation, you see that it says making her feel afraid by using looks, actions, and gestures. And then under the male privilege component, it's treating her like a servant. Overall, just saying using male privilege can seem one-sided for the person who's either discussing, presenting, or providing discussion or resources when they display power and control. So we looked into finding and using other power and control wheel models that we'll discuss. And we look at this wheel of power and control, the genders are removed, but then phobias are added and included. This can also be seen as offensive depending on the verbiage, whether a person considers a phobia to be disrespectful or an ism to not actually depict their gender preference and or sexual orientation. So some people may utilize this if they're focusing or solely directing working with LGBTQ populations, and some may not. But considering that this actually exists and it removed biases or removed gender, we also looked for a wheel that removed the phobias and isms terminology. And we found a neutral power and control model. So this power and control model removes isms, phobias, and genders. So let's look at all 8 components, starting with using economy as abuse. That's preventing someone from working, taking someone's money, controlling all the money or giving an allowance, using threats, making or executing threats to hurt someone, to leave them, commit suicide, or report them, Using intimidation, making someone afraid by using looks, actions, gestures, displaying weapons, or destroying property. Using emotional abuse, name calling, playing mind games, humiliation, putting someone down, making them feel guilty or think they're crazy. Using isolation, using jealousy to justify actions, limiting involvement with family and friends or the outside world, controlling what a person does, who they talk to, where they go. Denying, minimizing, and blaming, saying the abuse did not happen, shifting responsibility or physical behavior, not taking someone's concern seriously, making light of abuse. Using children, making someone feel guilty about the children, using children to relay messages or threatening to take the children away. Making all the big decisions, treating someone like a servant, defining the roles in each person in the relationship, of each person in the relationship. So again, if we remember our definition of domestic violence, whether it's physical, sexual, intimidating, patterns of behavior or power and control. So this is the power and control components that were discussed and defined in domestic violence, or in the domestic violence definition. So again, this is neutral. It can be used with men and women, individuals who identify as different types of genders or have different sexual orientations and or preferences. So those were our three wheels. This is our triangle. Cartman's drama triangle. There are three different positions: the prosecutor, the rescuer, and the victim. The situation determines the position on the triangle and can change at any point in time. The individual or person may switch positions as needed to get their needs met. So an individual can go from being a bully, a prosecutor for blaming others for all their problems and dominating or putting other people down, to being a rescuer and wanting to gain self-esteem and helping others, trying to fix or has the need to fix problems. It feels like they're a failure when other people complain. And then they could shift to being a victim, where they feel hopeless, trapped, ashamed, or guilty, or they seek others to solve their problems or give them validation. They often or sometimes refuse to make decisions. So this triangle can be one person that experiences all three positions, depending on what they're experiencing and where they're at. So an example of a bully could be a child who's bullying another child at school because they're being victimized at home. Then they could shift to being the helper of others or the rescuer of others or coming to other people's needs. Then they could also shift to being the victim. Say they get caught bullying and they say that they were they felt hopeless and they felt trapped. So, or they felt helpless. So these are three different positions that one person can experience, again, depending on where they're at or what needs they have. It's often interesting to review this type of information in an individual setting and or group setting, because sometimes these are easily seen and or shift depending on the circumstances. So we have covered our three wheels and a triangle. I'm going to shift back to counseling considerations a little bit, because again, this can be heavy, triggering information to hear and or discuss. So to give people a moment to utilize their coping skills, especially if they're triggered, that should be considered when working with individuals and or providing services. Just a side note, individuals who go into helping professions often go into helping professions because of their own personal experiences. So it's very common for counselors or individuals that advocate or provide services to have been exposed to or experienced domestic violence in their life. So that doesn't exclude them from having their own triggers as well. So self-care is definitely important. Considering healthy ways to process domestic violence information is also important. whether it's images, content, verbiage, tone. Being mindful of that can help an individual process this information in a healthy manner. Utilizing non-biased resources. An example of that would be just seen with the power and control wheel. An extension of that could be music videos that are being used, or video clips that are being used, and even discussions, discussions about race, discussions about gender. Those factors and that information and those resources should be as non-biased as possible. Considering same-sex factors, there's not a lot of domestic violence services that focus on same-sex relationships. There is training that looks at the LGBTQ plus community and population and addresses factors related to how to treat same-sex relationships, and also considering that those factors should be embedded in services and as part of the counseling relationship. So the same-sex factors should definitely be something to consider. And then last but not least, cultural differences, whether it's race differences. One of the bigger differences that's been found is religion. It take an extremely long time to cover all the different cultures and dynamics as it relates to relationships. This is mentioned because counselors often work with individuals from different cultural backgrounds, so acknowledging and considering cultural differences can be important in understanding the roles and dynamics of a relationship. So after looking at counseling considerations, let's look at options. People should know what their options are. So individual counseling is an option and can also be beneficial. No couples counseling. What I mean by that is most states, or some states, do not allow victims of domestic violence to engage in couple counseling with their partners. That's not to say that they're not couples in counseling, because some cases of domestic violence are not severe or they're not physical. They could be verbal forms of domestic violence, and in those, or intimidating forms of domestic violence. And in those cases, it is common for like a partner to engage in couples counseling to blame the other party, or intimidate or talk down about them in front of someone else. And oftentimes the counselor can identify this as a domestic violence type of relationship and recommend other resources, but generally not continue to provide counseling to an individual or couple who is displaying signs of domestic violence in the relationship. Now, family and groups. Family can consist of parent and child, or parent and children in counseling, and it also consists of an individual going to some type of group counseling, whether it's domestic violence counseling or anger management counseling. Those are usually in forms of groups. Specialized and focus groups. Individuals may seek counseling that's specific, whether it's individual or group, based off of certain topic. An example could be going to see someone who is trained, or going to a addictions counselor, or going into a sex addiction or sexual trauma specialist, or a sexual trauma focus groups. So those are some of the options that individuals have as far as counseling services are concerned. So now that we've looked at counseling options, let's look at counseling therapy. First one we're going to look at is person-centered. Person-centered focuses on providing a healthy work environment, creating a therapeutic relationship. Sometimes it can allow a counselor working with a client to create a very healthy relationship. And in some cases, with individuals who've experienced domestic violence, it can be the first healthy relationship that they've created. Adlerian therapy looks at early childhood memories. This can be helpful if someone who's experienced domestic violence during childhood. It looks at inferiority and superiority complexes, family dynamics, and also looking at a person from a whole. Individuals are often encouraged to increase their self-awareness and work often with creating their own sense of self-identity. So cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, looks at creating new thinking and behavioral patterns. And then rational emotional behavioral therapy, REBT, looks at reducing negative behaviors or emotions. CBT and RBT are billable therapies. They're also evidence-based therapies and interventions. Adlerian therapy and CBT also have play therapy. So there's Adlerian play therapy or Adlerian child play therapy, and then there is CBT child play therapy as well. So those two can be utilized for children. And then contemplative practices. So contemplative practices really focuses on mindfulness, responsibility, and ownership. And there are also daily activities that can be incorporated as well. These practices include spiritual practices, meditation, self-awareness, relaxation techniques, things like journaling. So these are things that individuals can learn to do on their own and or use these contemplative practices to create coping skills that they can use throughout their therapy or throughout their lifetime, really. So person-centered Adlerian therapy, CBT, REBT, and contemplative practices are just a few types of counseling therapy that can be used for treating someone with domestic violence experiences. So now we're going to talk about the types of resources that may be beneficial for a victim of domestic violence, survivor, and or abuser. And a lot of times this is overlooked. I found this to be beneficial when I completed my domestic violence training, which was to discuss legal aid and assistance. Actually, earlier on, was really powerful to learn more about organizations that are willing to provide like pro bono types of assistance, even assistance to individuals who are undocumented, whether it's they're being a victim or experiencing violence, domestic violence in their home, or abuse via their job, like a manager or supervisor or something like that. So there are quite a few different organizations and agencies that provide legal aid assistance. It's normally a local, actually I would say either within the city or within the state, but there's quite a few that can be found online as far as services that can help with things like court orders and restraining orders, or just understanding the legalities of domestic violence. Another component and resource that can be helpful is career and financial training, since sometimes manipulation can be money or things that pertain to money or financial issues, or individual who hasn't been able to work or obtain some type of education or actually developed a career. So career training and financial training are often helpful. And then there's parenting skills. Sometimes it's working with parents to create healthier parenting skills, or to learn parenting skills that would benefit their child after, if we say both parent and child experience domestic violence in the home. So those parenting skills references can be very helpful. I know that we've mentioned therapy and counseling there are individuals who have benefited and are engaged in sex therapy. I could have included sex therapy as or in the counseling slides, but I felt like it would be a little better suited here because counseling and sex therapists is often it has its own approach, and I've worked with clients who've benefited from some type of sex therapy that's not necessarily a counseling, quote unquote, type of therapeutic approach to help them with their sexual desires or sexual needs. So that's a looking at it from a more open perspective for individuals who may benefit from having sex therapy, whether they've had accumulated trauma or issues with just sexuality or dysfunctions or things like that, or just being comfortable within their own sexuality, or what maybe this may be a good way to create a healthy perspective on their sexual relationship with someone else after having experienced domestic violence. So those are our 4 types of resources that we wanted to list and mention. So I added a slide due to the fact that schools and a lot of people have not returned to work because of COVID-19. And considering that schools and work places were often a safe environment for people to either get away from or get a break from an environment where domestic violence could be prominent. A lot of times, even for children, they would have a teacher or a school counselor to help them with their domestic violence needs, as in a work environment where there could be a supervisor or a boss or someone who can actually send an individual to like an employee assistance program to help provide support. And since a lot of people are at home and children are at home, that engagement may be reduced. Then there is the issue of repeated trauma. It's possible that trauma or domestic violence and could be higher, the rates could be higher, or they could be more repetitive because people are at home or are not able to go visit family or get out of the house as much. So a lot of mental health professionals are keeping in mind that the trauma may be more repetitive or repeated more often. Then there's the lack or limited amount of resources. And this could be because, or simply because people are at home, their abuser may be at home and they don't feel comfortable talking virtually to someone over the phone or over the computer. So there might be a limited window when they can talk to somebody, or they may fear that they may be caught engaging in services. So then there's that lack of people actually having services or being able to engage in services for fear of safety issues. And then last but not least, additional mental health concerns. Considering that, there's a lot of grief because of the deaths of people passing away from COVID, because, people could become more worried, or their anxiety levels could increase if they are engaging in these services or if they're not. Mood changes could be higher now, or acuity levels could be higher now or changing because of the lack of being able to get out, or because of just adjusting to all the changes related to COVID. So we wanted to mention that and point that these things could definitely impact someone who is in treatment or in need of treatment right now. I know mental health professionals are considering these things and trying to create or adapt to these changes as well, to provide services and keeping these in mind when working with someone or knowing someone who may or may not be experiencing domestic violence, that these changes could definitely be impacting their overall experiences. So that is the end of the information that we have to discuss and or provide. We decided not to include any case scenarios because it may have been more triggering given the nature of the topic. If anyone is experiencing any type of emotional distress, please take care of yourself and or reach out to someone for support. You can also visit our website at www.goldencentury.com and leave a message or have someone leave a comment for someone to reach out to contact you. Also, if there's anything that was said or done, or anyone who has any feedback or questions or comments, please also feel free to reach out to us as well. This was interesting to create and put together while being mindful of, again, the sensitivity of the topic. So hopefully that was done in a healthy manner. And again, we'd like to thank you for your time and considering learning more about domestic violence. Hopefully there's something that you gained or learned from and found beneficial. So we'd like to thank people who take the time to learn about these topics, either for themselves or others. So many blessings and take care.